Hello. Intro-
Okay, I'm Mia. That's Evan. That's Anaya. That's Ian, and that's Jamie. Got it?
Uh,
Cool.
and we're going to be talking about Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
Slaughterhouse Proof, as it is called in the
Yes.
book.
Makes sense since it's from Germany.
It's about
It does. It does indeed.
and we learned where the name came from, which is the Slaughterhouse 5, which was the address of Slaughterhouse where they took refuge.
Also, it was a pig slaughterhouse.
Isn't it kind of
slaughtered pigs there, which is a little ironic, if
I
you
find
ask me.
Yeah, it is a little ironic. I find
Because
I do find it.
it's Germany, and they're like, I mean, now that they're, I can't say this without sounding really racist.
Okay, then don't say it. Okay. I do find it funny that he named it Slaughterhouse 5 because technically, if it wasn't for that slaughterhouse, he wouldn't be around to write that book because of the bombing of Dresden, which I find which is kind of funny because throughout the entire reading of the book, I was just like, why is it called Slaughterhouse? There's no mention of a slaughterhouse, and it could have been like metaphor until it was like chapter 6 or 7 where they actually like make it to Dresden and they go into the slaughterhouse, and then the bombing of Dresden happened. They hid in the slaughterhouse, and it was because of that slaughterhouse that they lived and were able to tell the story of the bombing of Dresden, which might be the reason that it's called that.
And it's also called the Children's Crusade because they're children.
It's also called the Children's Crusade, which is
nice. He actually kept his promise at the beginning.
Yeah,
I think he promised I won't make it for like a bunch of grown adults doing something.
I wrote my lit device about that quote.
I don't remember exactly, but I just thought it was nice because it's like, you did keep your promise.
Yeah.
No one else knows what you're talking about.
I mean, it's kind of a theme throughout the book, the people keeping their promises, because the Billy is murdered at the end by the guy who keeps his promise to kill Billy.
That is true. What's another promise kept? There's the guy who keeps his promise to kill Billy at the end.
There's probably other ones, or at least those bookend the book.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. He made the promise that the book would start and with Billy Baldwin came unstuck in time and
Poteweet.
England quote of the whole book.
That was gonna be my favorite quote was Poteweet.
Poteweet. Yeah, and I'm curious. I forgot there was a reason in the first chapter why he put so much emphasis on Poteweet because he was in the first chapter he was talking about like all like when it comes to war all that ends with so short and jumbled and jangled. This is on page 24. So short and jangled, Sam, because there's nothing intelligent about a massacre. Everybody is supposed to be dead, to never say anything or want anything ever again. Everything is supposed to be very quiet after a massacre. It always is, except for the birds. And what do the birds say? All there is to say about a massacre, things like Pootweet. I think it's supposed to symbolize kind of like what the John Green video talks about, which is like massacres are like unspeakably terrible things, and in order to deflect about like a terrible event that people can't process, they like dumb it down using like similes and like metaphors and stuff. So like,
which is interesting because it took Vonnegut 25 years to write this book, like because he couldn't figure out how to, even though it happened to him and he had lived through it. And he wrote a lot of other books that actually involve a lot of the other same characters in this book, Kilgore Trout and a bunch of the other people. But it was because he couldn't figure out how to talk about it. So it makes sense. I mean, the birds are kind of a big thing because nature survives. But
reminds me of that poem we read during the multiple choice thing we did this morning. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, like how she was sitting there and was like the birds. Something about the birds shouldn't be able to talk.
It was.
Yeah, it was about I think it was about the squirrels. They were saying how like the squirrels were like, or no, it was birds. You were right. It was birds. It was robins. They were chirping
This is-
and tweeting. They,
The last stanza is, let them leave language to their lonely betters, who count some days and long for certain letters. We too make noises when we laugh or weep, words are for those with promises to keep.
Weep.
Yeah,
mhm.
yeah,
It even rhymes.
it does.
Yeah, it's a rhyming couplet.
It is.
But yeah, no,
Hokey
words
weep?
are for those with
No.
promises to keep. Yeah, that's a surprising lot of similarity
I also
to.
like how it continues the circle. It's like everything has to come back one time before the book ends.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
does.
Which is kind of annoying, but it's
Yeah,
nice.
I wanted Robert to go away. I didn't.
Mhm.
What about
I feel like there's
Is
always.
that his name?
I don't know why.
The 19-year-old?
The mean guy
Uh-huh.
who claims that Billy was the reason for his death at the end, and makes the one guy promise to kill
Yeah,
him.
that guy.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. I
The
think
yeah,
his
the,
name is
the guy who
Robert.
had the guy who had all the gear, military gear, and we went very in depth into his backstory just for him to like die of gangrene or something.
Right. Because he had to wear weird boots, right?
Yeah, he had the
Yeah.
weird boots. And he had like the gun. He had the tripod. That's something I noticed about a lot. It's like there's there's kind of like stages in his life, and in like most stages, there's like one like just like really like mean like cruel guy. There's like one really cruel person. There's at first there's like when he's like enlisted into the war. There's what's his name?
Robert.
Robert. Yeah, there's Robert who we go very in depth into his backstory.
But
About
why
how
do we go in depth into his backstory?
they talked about like his family, didn't he? His family life and how like his, yeah.
I think it was interesting because apparently Robert and Billy were both based off of real people.
No, it was Roland. Roland Weary.
Roland
That's his
Weary.
name.
Roland Weary.
There's
Yeah.
a different
Roland,
No,
not Robert.
But
Roland.
both of them were based off of real people that Vonnegut didn't reveal until like right before he died because he was waiting for like their parents to die. And so these were real people that he knew when he was there.
Mhm.
I guess it makes sense if you put it in the context of the last chapter when it's in first person again.
But I think,
And it's like,
Right.
But
but Roland I think is supposed to be like the quintessential like military guy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, the fact that he's like 19, all I could think of was that dulcet decorum from when we read.
Oh, like die for our country. It's
Yeah.
so brave to die for your country. And they were all little kids.
Yeah.
But if you know anybody in like ROTC or like even now, like they're like, yeah, let's go, let's go fight and let's go do
That's
this.
true.
I mean, like, she loves war.
That sounds bad.
Who?
You know what I mean?
Oh, what?
I don't know if you know.
She's in our government class, and she like is an ROTC, and like it's very much an advocate for war is how we solve problems.
Oh.
But there's
like
a
people
lot
like
of
that.
like this point though, right? There's a lot of Rolands and there's a lot of Billies
Yeah.
in militaries.
I think it's because it's so romanticized. It's like,
yeah, military. Yeah, this feels This feels anti-war in a way, but like it doesn't feel like as like persistent and anti-war. It feels like very subtle. Talking about like how the Dresden, there's like parts near the end where it's talking about how like the Dresden massacre wasn't publicized to the masses because of all the allies that were killed during the bombing of Dresden, and there was oh yeah, sorry, what I was saying, a little bit of a topic switch just to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, which was that there's like a lot of people who like are pro-war in the book, and there are a lot of, and they're pretty like very cruel people that we see. Like there's Wary, there's that one guy, I forgot his name. Zorro. Yeah, who swears to kill him,
Yeah.
and he also talks about how he like killed his dog by making him
that
eat.
was weird.
He was so gross.
Honestly,
I
I
killed
don't
his
even know
dog
if that
because
guy
I
has
like make
anything
him
to-
swallow like a pin or something like that.
I don't know if that guy had anything to do with war, but he's just psychotic.
That's kind of, I think that's the message, is that that's what war demands of somebody.
Because that's what the book like as a whole is. It's just like the senseless mindlessness of violence that war is.
Yeah,
It's
but he
just
was like that before.
And war's a
And
perfect
then-
environment for someone like
That's
that.
true.
You can get
away with a lot of weird psychotic
yeah.
stuff.
yeah.
There's a lot of psychotic people out there. Some of them go to
War's the
therapy, they
perfect
get better.
place
War is
to
a perfect place to
create a
foster
homicidal
psychotic.
maniac.
There's also that one guy when Billy was in the hospital after that plane crash, who was next to him, who would
Oh, that
talk
was
about
Ronald. That was Robert.
that was Robert,
That was Robert.
and he was just a
Eicher.
really pro war, really like just a bad guy to his girlfriend, to his 21 girlfriend when he was 60.
Oh yeah, I hate
And
that
he was super why do we keep this guy in the hospital? He's not even a person. That's a
Yeah.
vegetable. Why are we even keeping him here? He was a very apathetic person who was also very pro-war. And I think that kind of hints back to the promise he made with that one woman at the start of the chapter where she was upset. She was like, "Oh, you're just gonna make a pro-war book that talks about guys running around with guns." But
I mean, this is one of the most famous anti-war books.
yeah. Sorry,
But what does it have to say about war? I guess you talked about some of it. Huh?
Miss Adams gave us a bunch of articles. Or she gave us one article that was like a New York Times article or something about how this book like changed the 20th century. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I didn't read her article.
I didn't either. I just saw the
It
headline.
Yeah, it was like, now we don't like war as much.
Yeah, because of this book is basically what it was.
Well, one of the reasons that this book is a famous anti-war book is because it deals with in ways that nobody talked about because it didn't exist prior to when this book came out. But about the time jumping and the Trafalgar,
The hand guys.
yeah, the hand guys.
I've listened to the audiobook. I think they said Trafalgar.
Yeah, however you pronounce it. But in the time shifting and all of that.
Which we're all agreed that wasn't actually happening. He was just hallucinating and going crazy, right?
Yeah.
Well, but that's a question. I mean, I think you can read it either way. But one of the things is one of the ways to read this book is that it's all about both Vonnegut himself, but also Billy going through PTSD, right?
Yeah.
This is so impactful because before this, anti-war books are the physical aspects of what war caused, and then these guys are talking about how it affected you mentally.
Yeah.
And I feel like mental health wasn't. Oh my god! It feels like mental health wasn't talked about as much.
Well, I mean, remember at the time that this book came out, there was no diagnosis for PTSD, and nobody actually
didn't
do
World War
anything
II
about it.
create the term shell shock that eventually became?
That was World War One that
That's
created the term
Oh.
shell shock because that was the first time that big kind of war really happened, and so that veterans came back.
But even then, they still didn't get any mental health treatment or those kinds of things. I mean, not that mental health treatment was big in the 30s anyway.
But sleep it off.
Right, exactly. Be a man.
You're fine.
Right. But I mean, him switching in and out of time and all of those kinds of things and having these delusions. At least one way to read it is that it's all just undiagnosed PTSD.
I thought he was dying. When I first read this book, I thought at the end it'd be and then he closed his eyes and died.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we were just seeing his life flash before his eyes, but the fact that he was still there, I was like, oh no, you gotta live with that.
Well, it's interesting because his daughter's always trying to take care of him and be like, Dad, you're going crazy, and he gets kicked out of the radio station because he tries to talk about it and all those kinds of things.
He wrote that letter too.
Right.
I think.
So that's the PTSD part. What about the other reading, which is that all of that actually did happen?
I feel like
that's how I read it for most of it until I met Kilgore Trout.
Yeah.
Until that happened and until Elliot Rosewater happened, I thought that it was actually happening.
I kind of read it I kind of read it with the idea that it was going to be. I had two interpretations of mine as I was reading through. I thought either A, this is all going to be a big metaphor, and at the end it was all going to be a big metaphor at the end, it's going to be like I'm like painfully obvious that it was like a metaphor, or B, if there's going to be something, it's going to be like phrased as a metaphor, but then something's going to happen in the book that like shows it's all real.
Yeah.
And I'm leaning towards more metaphor, but it turns out the book did not end with it becoming painfully obvious. It just ended. It just ended. The story just continued
really
until it ended.
About,
it doesn't feel like there's a climax in the story.
It could have been real for him, though. Yeah. I mean, that's that part of it, right? I mean, even if like, because I mean, it was him being able to come to terms. I mean, even if you say, well, you know, it's all in his mind. It's him coming to terms and having sort of a language to talk about his failed marriage. So that's him and the movie star that he ends up hooking up with, and also like the war and death, because he can't process the death, and so they give him at least language, which is the so it goes thing, right?
Yeah.
That like for them, which is one of my favorite parts in the book, where they're like, they don't really believe in death, because if they look at a corpse, they're like, well, he's just not doing well right now, but at other points in time, he's fine.
No, yeah, that's really, I really like that like view, because I have an interpretation of that, but I might like take a while to talk about it. So I kind of want to hear your guys' interpretations of aliens for like a more in depth of like what you think your interpretation what like the aliens represent or symbolize.
My interpretation kind of had to do with my beautiful question that we had to write. We wrote questions that were like, I don't know how to describe it. That's what I'm not going to.
Anyway. Say your question.
It's kind of like 3 questions in one. It's, after trauma, is it possible for one to regain who they were, or would they crumble under the weight of it? And as they crumble, what happens when one lets fiction control one's life and their already crumbling sense of self? Because I felt like he was using Kilgore Trout's books as like a coping mechanism for like dealing with the trauma, because he didn't know how, which I think goes back to what you were saying about how he was being given the words of how to describe it, even though he can't really describe it. Because I mean, John Green, the Crash Course video, brought up this good quote that was like, no. It was the one where in the first chapter where Veronica was like, I can't describe it. Like, I thought that it would be easy because all I had to do was report what I saw. And he tried to do that and he couldn't do it because he couldn't find the words to describe it, which I think was really interesting. But I feel like engulfing your life with fiction to be able to describe something like that is a good book.
Which is also interesting because Kilgore Trout is a science fiction writer.
Yeah.
He's not a journalist. He's not a
I know that's why I use fiction.
Yeah.
But it's not even fiction. It's science fiction, which is a novel creation.
Fiction.
But it's different.
It's
science. It's still a fiction.
Well, I think it's under the fiction umbrella.
Deal with the technicality of a science fiction.
Well, you can. What?
I think it matters. I think it matters that Kilgore Trout is a science fiction writer.
Well, it's because it's like the aliens. I feel like it's like small bits of what he was seeing, and then he just blew it out of proportion.
Right.
So it's like some of it is truth. Like some of what he's seeing that's like seems absolutely like crazy is like a piece of what is actually happening, and then he's creating a story in his mind to cope with it.
Right.
If you think about literature, like science fiction is more removed from the element of humanity, where literature always focuses on humanity and how that goes. And so if you're suffering from PTSD,
DJs was about that.
Right.
I have my interpretation of the aliens is very similar to yours, which is just that it's a coping mechanism, and it becomes obvious because there's points where, or the point where he went to the veterinary's hospital, where he cuts back to the veterinary's hospital. There's points where he's like showing these Kilgore Trout novels that are talking about concepts very similar to very similar to what Hiyama is experiencing, and I think the point where I was officially like, yeah, it's a metaphor, is the one where he was like, this book actually contained aliens that came
Yeah,
down to Earth,
same.
which looked very much like Tralfadorians. Coincidentally, I was like, okay, yeah, that's aliens. But yeah, I think I think they're a very like symbolic of like coping mechanisms used by uh coping mechanisms used by veterans to like get through the day after experiencing what they did. Be- Uh, and I think a big part of that is because Tralfamadorians have a very apathetic view on life, and the entire book has a very apathetic view on life. I mean, obviously, there's every time someone dies, every time someone dies,
So it goes.
there's the same saying, so it goes,
It's not even
so
just
they go.
people. It's like every. It's not even just living things either. It's
Didn't
like
they talk about
every.
water at some point?
Yeah,
We talk about water, but
then,
yeah,
like, the
death
ways
is
soda popped.
death is generally associated with the term "so it goes."
This is
And this is actually what one of my DJs was about. Is that this not only that, but every time a character dies, there's no moment of pause or grieving for that character. They just die, and then they're not in the book anymore.
Probably a coping mechanism.
And that's exactly.
Billy had to learn in the war because like you don't get
Exactly.
time to grieve them.
And not only that,
They're just dead,
didn't
and
they
then
have to
you.
clean up the corpses?
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
like, oh,
Exactly.
Like, oh, lovely.
they're dead.
They're
And
dead.
the very apathetic view of like, oh, what happens when the Tralfamadorians die? They're just like, oh, we just don't care. We just don't look at their death. We see time as like a line. We go to the moments when they're alive, so we don't care about the fact that they're dead, which really devalues life, in my opinion. And that devaluing it doesn't devalue life in the way that it's like saying that like life is meaningless. It devalues life because it makes it feel like death doesn't have a purpose if you can just go back and see them when they're alive again, which is kind of a way that you have to think when you're in that situation because if you have to process the death of so many people, it feels like it can be very overwhelming. So that's a big thing that I feel that the Choppinorians like symbolize.
Well, and like looking at the idea of death within the book and of time, and how time, we usually think of it linearly, especially death, right? Like it's at the end of a human life. But if we're not looking at time linearly, then like that idea that we can always go back, and so someone can never truly be dead, right? And so like how do you like balance that with the idea of the idea of time?
But it's also, it's a coping mechanism to deal with something so horrific that you have no ability to process the amount of people that died and the senselessness of it all. I mean, that's sort of over and over again, even for, I think, for Vonnegut personally and also for Pilgrim and also all the rest of the things. I mean, that's the whole thing about, because it killed allies. I mean, this wasn't even a bombing of a military thing. I mean, there was, what was the point of any of this?
Yeah.
And so either you like are just completely depressed about it and you can't deal with it, or you create mechanisms, time jumps, science fiction. You fall into literature. You have a different view of what death means, which is also interesting because one of the um, this book is one of the most banned books in schools. It's like number 35 on the most banned books in the U.S. list. It's been
that makes me sick.
It's been the subject of like 4 different Supreme Court lawsuits.
Of course it has.
At least part of.
We can't talk about when we killed our own people. How dare you?
But one of the reasons that
they also kind of made the Allies the bad guys when they bombed Dresden.
Right. Well, yes.
Isn't okay.
I mean, it's
apparently. I was surprised.
It's not. But one of the things I think that's interesting, and one of the reasons that I never really thought about, I was reading something about it earlier, was about there's a big religious piece because this book, at least in part, rejects Christianity by rejecting sort of what.
Because there was that one part in the Kilgore when he explains the Kilgore novel.
Right. And sort of what death means as far as what in Christianity, as far as what God means. There's the discussion in, I think it's with Kilgore, where they talk about how, that that if there's a God, that God knew about this and he wanted it to happen or something like that. It's sort of like
Yeah.
why does God let bad things happen type of thing.
There's also this thing
Mhm.
about like the hand aliens. Like
Tralfamadorian.
yeah,
Yeah.
I gave up on
That's fair.
The T guys.
the T guys. The hand dudes. That's what I'm calling
Jazz
them.
hands.
Anyway, they. Train of thought. Come on. Anyway, that they like didn't. Not that they didn't necessarily not. They didn't. Words. Like their opinions on Jesus and like how they thought he was really interesting, but like they didn't think he was like that special or anything. I can't imagine that the government liked that. No, not the government. That people liked that very much.
Mhm.
I mean, it
How
challenges.
dare you?
It does challenge the status quo in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to go back to what you were saying about the book being very apathetic because I wrote my DJ about that and I liked it and I think it's interesting. It was based on this quote that the the hand dudes were talking about their types of books and how it's that they say there's no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. Um, I felt like that quote really encompassed like not just this book, but like all of classic literature, because I don't think that most classic literature has any plot. Like The Handmaid's Tale didn't have a plot. Like I'm gonna be honest, it just didn't. The ending was her just leaving. And then like Sawyer told me about
You mean that don't have an ending? Or
it
but
has an ending, it's just that like it doesn't really
Doesn't give you closure.
it doesn't give you closure.
okay.
And like Sawyer was telling me about Catcher in the Rye, which is the book that their group did. Um, and how the entire thing is just this guy walking around New York talking or thinking. And like and I said and I just think that like it's interesting because I don't think that it is apathetic because I think that the point of classic literature is to get you to feel something about something. Like Handmaid's Tale wanted you to feel something about women's equality, and this one wanted you to feel something about war, and Invisible Man wanted you to feel something about racism. And I said that the point of literature is to create empathetic people, and the point of classic literature is to make sure you're not too apathetic to realize that.
All right.
So,
What?
thank you.
That was good. I think I wrote a DJ that was similar about like their apathetic life, and I think I'm more focused on the fact that they don't believe that you have free will.
Oh, yeah,
That
was
the
interesting.
Tralfamadorians said that humans are one of the only people that believe in free will, which if we're going by which I don't know, in my opinion, living in a world without free will sounds like a very sad world, which but the Tralformians seem content in it because they know that like they also know how the death of the universe is going to happen, and they take no measures to stop it because they know it's just going to happen, and that does seem like a very apathetic worldview.
You can't stop it. You're not gonna spend like your last moments in time trying to stop it.
That's the thing, though, is that they'll never have their last moments in time.
But isn't that? I mean, going back to
Because they don't even have their first moments in time.
Yeah.
but going back to the Trafalgarians giving a language of coping, isn't that sort of the notion of like, if Dresden was always going to happen, and if you could have never stopped it, and this was never going to be any different, and this was sort of preordained, or this was just a moment in time that's always happening, and it couldn't have ever happened a different way. Isn't that easier to deal with?
It's easier to deal with something always never change. That's a good point. Is that it's a metaphor for like coping. If the end of the universe is always going to happen, and there's nothing we can do to stop it, then we shouldn't do anything to stop it. We shouldn't worry about
you
it.
don't have to feel guilt about it.
Right, you don't have to be guilty. You don't have to feel any pain about it.
Which is, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, on a certain level, I think the Trafalgarians are able to provide this language and these ways of discussing these things. But is that positive? I mean, it
Mhm.
might not be, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
can't say, well, I mean, if you say, well, this was always going to happen, then what's the point of learning from it? What's the point
That's
of
yeah.
making it better?
That's what I was thinking. Is that I think that it's
That makes
apathetic because
sense.
it doesn't imply that we can learn from our mistakes and make a better world because of us learning from those issues. If it's just, but also it does make you feel pretty good.
But
What's that? What's that belief called? There's like the
Nihilism?
belief that like there's like it's like a different form of nihilism where it's like nihilism you believe nothing matters or it's inconsequential, and then there's that other belief that I can't remember the term where it's like nothing is nothing matters, every we're just a small speck on the universe, but because of that we shouldn't worry about the small things,
right.
and we
Was it
shouldn't
like
worry.
that thing that we were talking about in English the other day that like Trey brought up about like the guy rolling the rock up the hill and how he said he was gonna
Yeah,
enjoy it.
Sisyphus. Yeah,
Yeah.
Sisyphus rolling up the
Was
hill,
it
but
that?
he must be happy because he's doing it every day, and yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Was it
living
like
with
that?
purpose in his life. But
Is it like
it's yeah, it's similar to
similar
that.
to
If
that?
it's like
Okay.
if the world's so big and inconsequential and nothing we do matters, then why should we sweat when something small happens to us? And
Yeah.
just why not
That's
do anything
really
but live our best life because nothing matters. And I feel like that is a very clear that is a um I feel like that's an all right notion to live by. I feel like this takes that kind of to an extreme in this book, that belief.
Although interestingly enough, I mean that's Billy's not based off of Vonnegut. It's based on somebody else that he knew. And
I thought he was just based off.
no, he's based off of somebody particular. Um,
Oh.
but the other part is that I don't know that Vonnegut's apathetic because why would he have written the book? I mean,
No, yeah.
you know, I think that I mean he is trying to make a better world and trying to talk about this and trying to figure out
Yeah.
ways to actually discuss these things.
Mhm.
And write something that it took him 25 years to write. Because if he was just apathetic and just thought, well, nothing matters and all of this is preordained and you can never change anything, what's the point of writing?
Right. Yeah.
What's the point of
I do
any
think.
art
Yeah.
at that
I do
point?
think that. Yeah. I do think. And he wrote this book for like 25. He felt like he had a responsibility to
Mhm.
release this book, which takes some drive beyond boredom, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
I also asked the question if he thinks he had the responsibility, would he have thought he had the responsibility to write it if everyone else didn't think he had the responsibility to write it?
That's fair. I mean,
Because this is a really anticipated book. I mean, most of the reviews are like the most highly anticipated book of the 20th century. Woo! But like, if no
Bonnet
one else
doesn't.
had that expectation
Yeah.
of him, would he have had that expectation of himself? Would this book even exist?
If I don't. Yeah. I don't know.
I mean,
I
he
obviously
had
don't.
written a lot of other books up to this point and a lot of other stories and other things. And so,
Uh-huh.
I mean, you know, if you're an artist, you often have that thing in your mind that it takes you a long time to be able to talk about. I mean, whether it's like something from your history or some issue that you having a hard time dealing with.
Also, I don't know Vonnegut, but yeah, so I'm just this is just an opinion of mine that I formed reading the book, but I don't think he's the type of person to like I don't think he's the type of person to be like peer pressure.
I think that's right.
He seems yeah.
Yeah.
If it was like most highly anticipated book, I feel like he would have no problem being like, oh, actually, I'm not making this book that you all want me to make. But I don't know him, so I can't say that for certain, obviously.
I think that John Green.
Yeah. But
There's a good quote. So I can find it.
Where do you find that? I had a thought. I don't know if it had to do it. But I was watching. It actually does have to do with John Green. Funny enough. Stop laughing at me.
John Green.
I am. I agree. No, it has to do with this video I watched a while ago of him saying that it had to do with the free will conversation we were having. He was saying that he doesn't think that any other like organism or like animal or whatever would be as good at being as civilized as humans are as we are. Does that make sense? free will.
I suppose if you gave animals consciousness, they wouldn't be as nearly as civilized as
Yeah,
humans.
exactly. Pretty much is basically what he was saying, and I think that's interesting because, like, if I don't know, birds, for example, 'cause that seems to be a common theme in this conversation, and the book, um, were in the same civilization that humans were, for example, then like would they have the um, concept of free will if no one else in the universe had it except for humans? Then what's the probability that they would have the idea of free will? And I mean, you said it's like it would be a pretty depressing world to live in if we didn't think we had free will, which I mean, some people do, some people don't. But like, I don't know, I think it's an interesting thought that humans are the best at being.
That's a good theme of Oedipus too. Going like classical novels,
Yeah.
always kind of set. Like their whole theme all the time was just so sad and depressing. It's like he was trying to like have his own free will and like fight against
Yeah.
what was preordained, and then he ended up causing that.
I mean, most books are about free will, right?
This is a
Handmaid's Tale is about free will.
this is a good quote that goes with this. One of the big arguments, actually, and one of the big criticisms of Slaughterhouse Five was that the notion of time presented in Slaughterhouse Five, as far as the fatalism, it says Vonnegut um, deprecates any attempt to see tragedy that day in Dresden. He likes to say, with arch fatalism, citing one horror after another, so it goes. Vonnegut has total sympathy with such quietistic impulses, which goes to the sort of like, this is just how it goes and you can't change anything and all those kinds of things. It says, when confronted with the question of how the desire to improve the world, his own desire to improve the world, fits with the notion of time presented in Slaughterhouse Five, Vonnegut himself responded, quote, you understand, of course, everything I say is horseshit.
That is incredible.
It's pretty great. Which is, I mean, goes along with the notion of him saying, look, I'm trying to deal with something that you can't deal
That
with.
you can't. Yeah, I'm trying to deal with something that you cannot conceptualize.
Right.
When you can never come to a conclusion of it, it's always going to be
right.
It's always going to happen.
I had one more thing that I was thinking about that I'd like to just briefly talk about before the book ends over, which is that the glaring obvious structure of the book, which is that it's always jumping back and forth between different memories.
This is a weird like frame structure.
Yeah, it's a weird frame structure. It's like it feels like it kind of feels like it's going to a point at some point where in between jumps he's going like he's slowly progressing through like different hops and memories where he's going from like being enlisted in the war, going to going to battle, getting captured by German soldiers, going into the prison, being in the prison. Cinderella happens. Then they go to Dresden, and it feels like that, but it's in between. It feels like there's like that progression, that natural progression, but it's in between all of these different memories and like descriptions of seemingly inconsequential details. Thank you. Inconsequential details and just a bunch of like stuff. And I think that the structure of the book is supposed to be a metaphor for PTSD or and similar things of trauma like that, where if you
I think it's that, but also memory. I mean, if you think back on some event, you're not going to remember it linearly.
Yeah, no, yeah,
right. That is a good point. You're gonna jump around. You're gonna be like, oh, and then there was this, and oh yeah, I remember that. There was that one guy.
It's kind of supposed to simulate like someone like telling you a story about what happened.
Yeah, but you can't really do that in a book. It's a really difficult thing to do in a book when you try to jump around linearly, which is why I think that science fiction element of becoming unstuck in time is involved, because like that's a really difficult thing to do well in a book, to like jump around like that, like you're telling a story, because you're gonna lose people if you can't.
That probably happened to a lot of people that read this book. They
I'm sure. I got lost a few times.
That's fair. I personally was able to like piece together the story, kind of like a really weird puzzle as I continued like listening and reading. It was hard, obviously. There was like points where I wasn't clear on all the details, but I think it's I think it's told that way to kind of represent like what you said, memory and PTSD, and like remembering back. There's also situations where he has like really harsh reactions, like the barbershop quartet, and he realizes why, which was that the guards looked like a barbershop quartet
Yeah,
when they were
weird.
looking off into thing, and uh, I think it's kind of convenient that he has that strong reaction to the barbershop quartet and then travels back in time exactly to the point where he realizes where that strong reaction came from.
That was weird. And a very good descriptor of like PTSD and flashbacks and trauma and mental health and that kind of a thing.
Hmm. And yeah, that's just my interpretation of why the story is written like that. If you guys have
It's
anything to
also,
add.
I mean, having read a lot of other Vonnegut books, he writes in that sort of style anyway, where it's very small paragraphs, very straightforward.
Mhm.
The language isn't that complicated.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like any of his books are that long either.
Well, I mean, they're all. I mean, about this is about the length. There's a couple more that are a little longer, a little shorter, whatever. But he writes in that sort of that sort of choppy rhythm, which I really like. I like it when he jumps around and kind of tells these different pieces of the story, and kind of tells you about this guy and goes on with his relationship. But like I said, I think it's even more effective here by really dealing with the memory piece of it, where. And again, it's also similar to if I'm going to tell you something that's really uh, traumatic to me, I'm also not going to tell it linearly. I'm going to jump around a lot, and I'm going to tell you about my family now, or if you ever talk to a veteran. I mean, if you talk to somebody who's actually been through something like that, they don't talk linearly. Or if you talk to somebody with mental illness, they don't talk linearly. They talk all over the place.
Think about that.
But eventually, you can kind of follow the story if you pay attention.
Mhm.
So there.
Well, anyone have anything else? Any last minute closing thoughts? No? Great.
Are you sure?
Bye.
Okay, do my same.